So this is one of a three-part series that we offer. We're going to go through part one today, and the other two will be offered at a later time this month. If you miss any of the parts, they will be recorded and posted later, so you can go back and catch them. Today's session is a little bit of background information about NIH and how you can determine if you've got the right opportunity announcement to work with to do your submission, and some internal information. And we'll touch on a little bit of some changes that have come out recently in the last few months on some notices that have been published. So the NIH is under the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. It's one of several agencies that are under DHHS. Their mission is to support the health and well-being of the nation. They have 11 divisions. Each of these divisions usually has their own section of the NIH website, and they do their own announcements for funding opportunities. They have an office of secretary and many division heads that are done by presidential appointment. So that is something to keep in mind, because whenever the president changes, a lot of times the leadership of NIH will also change, which may direct some pockets of funding and how it's spent. On their website, they have a section on grants and contracts that has different policies and how to register for ERA Commons and how to apply. And it's a really high level type of view. As we go through these different sessions, I'll mention a couple of other links that they have, because there's a lot of training and additional information that they do have available on their website. So NIH's mission is to increase fundamental knowledge about the nature and behavior of living systems. And so their announcements are going to be related to subjects in those areas. There are 27 different institutes and centers, and all of those provide pockets of funding available for researchers. So it's very important for you to try and determine which institute or center that you might be applying to most often for the funding that you're seeking. 80% of their funding normally is awarded to extramural research. So we get a pretty good chunk of funding that comes in from NIH. They do have their own laboratories, which you have the opportunity as researchers to submit proposals to go to work at those campuses. And they also offer some internships, both short-term ones like for just the summer, and long-term ones that you might want to check with those centers or laboratories to see what information might be available if you're interested in gaining that knowledge and relationship with them. At the link www.nih.gov, when you first go into it, there is some budget information that might be interesting for you to look at. It has information on success rates for certain proposals. You can also search information on funded proposals, where it'll give you like the abstract, so you have an idea of what that researcher proposed, and possibly can work on making some linkages with some other professors that are working in areas that you're also interested in. They have a very large FAQ section on their website that not only includes information on common questions they get on grants and funding, but also has information about news and events and upcoming conferences. Some of the conferences that NIH hosts are free, and some are paid, and some of the paid ones also have areas within them that are available to the general public or for free too. So if you're interested in learning more about how NIH operates, or possibly meeting with a program officer that's coming to a regional conference someplace, so you don't have to travel to DC, then this would be an area that you might want to look at. There's also organizational charts for all the institutes and centers that are posted under this FAQ. So when you start looking for funding announcements for NIH, you can go to this link that's on here for the grants-funding. You can also look in grants.gov, Beta SAM, and on the OU VPRP website. There are some commercial data mining software like Pivot that has access to their postings too. And many times you can just do a general internet search on NIH funding and maybe type in a keyword for the area that you're interested in to find out different solicitations that might be available. One of the things that might help the most, though, is if you can find what institute or center normally funds the type of work that you're interested in doing. And NIH does have a tool to try and help you narrow down your search on what centers or institutes might be providing funding. And that's through this project reporter link that's listed down here. And you're always welcome to contact the program officers at NIH and discuss with them either other institutes or centers besides the program officers that you're talking to, so that you have an idea. The reason I mention this is because most of the institutes and centers also have a specific listserv that you can sign up for, and whenever they get ready to announce a funding opportunity, they usually will post it on their specific listserv. And sometimes you'll even get a heads up notice. For example, we're going to drop the announcement XXX related to this type of research at the end of the month or in September. And so you might get a 2 or 3 month head start to start updating your biosketch and things like that, that you don't need this specific opportunity to be able to work on. So in general, the different types of announcements that NIH puts out are called parent announcements, program announcements, requests for applications, requests for proposals, and notices. So parent announcements are usually a huge type of set of proposals. They have standard receipt dates. Many of you, if you've done very many proposals, are probably already familiar with these. They have like the R01, the R03, the R21, and they normally will post them every year to 2 years, and you submit your package to those, and they review them, and then they put them out to the different review panels that they're going to be going to. So there are always parent announcements that are out there. So these are kind of like unsolicited proposals, just open based on the type of work that you want to be doing in your research area. Then they have program announcements, usually based on some type of special interest or priority that they're seeking work in at NIH. They usually also follow the standard receipt dates, just like the parents do, and they're usually 3-year proposals. And so those come out as PARs, so they have the program announcements with a receipt or review consideration, and what they call a PASS, a program announcement that has set aside funds. So when you see a PASS announcement, that means they already have funds setting aside for it. They don't have to go anywhere within the agency to ask for funds out of the budget or anything like that. If you see a PAR or just a program announcement, then that means they're wanting this work done, but they don't actually have the budget set aside for it. They've made their initial projections, and when they finally get ready to select their final proposals that they're going to possibly fund, then they'll go back within their division and secure the final budget for those. The request for application is usually a narrowed interest. Sometimes the funds are set aside for them, sometimes they're not. They usually will have a specific submission date outside of the routine ones. So for example, the routine deadlines in June are the 5th and the 16th. So you might have a special RFA come out that says the date for this one is June the 21st. So you want to be sure and look at your deadline dates if you're looking at applying for an RFA. An RFP is very similar to an RFA. It's more of a contract type of proposal, but many times when it comes to dealing with universities, they will still issue the RFPs as a cooperative agreement. It doesn't make a lot of difference to us internally whether they're going to process it as a research agreement or a contract. It'll go through the same basic process within the Office of Research Services. It just may impact some of your reporting requirements during post-award. Then they have notices. So notices usually you don't submit to a notice, but a notice can impact a submission or give you information about policy changes or provide limits or information about things. So examples of common notices that come out, usually we get one each year about the NIH salary cap. And so this is a notice that affects how much you can ask for salary-wise for certain senior personnel if their salary is over what that cap is. They also have notices of special interest. They're called NOCIs that can come out. And we saw quite a few of these with COVID, and we still see one once in a while. And usually when they issue a NOCI, they give you instructions in that actual notice on how you are going to indicate that you want to apply for that special interest area. Most of the time, they'll tell you, if you want to apply to this NOCI, please put this information on this block of the 424 on this list, the submission that you are already going to submit to a parent announcement, an RFA, or an RFP or PA. So it's not like you're submitting the entire package is going to go specifically for that notice of special interest. It's that you're going to flag your submission that you want it considered for that notice of special interest, which is always good to know because that may put you in the running for a special pool of funds that's already been set aside for that notice of special interest. Most of the time, all of these informations, especially for like your program announcements, your RFAs, and your notices, are going to have listed on it an actual NIH staff member or an office that you can direct questions to. And so that is usually helpful too. Most of the solicitations that we see nowadays will specify if the research that you're doing involves clinical trials or not, then it may impact the type of application package that's pulled down that's actually filled out and submitted by ORS. They do have a site that you can go to at NIH to try and help you determine whether or not you should be using a clinical trials required package or not, if you have the option to pick one or the other. And I would note that don't assume if you're working with human subjects because you're doing XYZ that you don't have to use that clinical trials required format, because NIH defines intervention pretty much as involvement. So if you're not sure, be sure and go to this website and do those 4 questions and see what it tells you as far as whether you should be using the clinical trials package or not. When you're looking at your opportunities, you want to make sure that you do have the current version and that you're using the correct one for the type of work that you're doing. So is it clinical trials work or not? Are you or is OU eligible to be a recipient of funding from that particular opportunity? There are times that they will issue some that you're limited by the type of training that you have, or possibly where you are in your career path. Maybe it's only eligible for postdocs. Maybe it's only eligible for minority serving institutions. So you have to check those things out. You want to make sure that you know what the deadline is. Most of the time, the opportunities will have a link that'll take you to the deadline, or it'll fall under the normal ones, which this link will take you to. Or it'll be specific and it'll list in the guidelines what the specific deadline is. And one of the things I want to mention about this link that it takes you to is you want to look at that whole table when you go in there, because some types of submissions are listed more than once. So for example, if you were going to do an R01 submission, there is an R01 due date, a set of due dates for an initial R01 submission. And then there's a second set of deadlines for an R01 resubmission. So let's say you submitted last year and you want to submit again, that would be a resubmission. So you would have to make sure you're looking at those particular dates. You're always going to use the general NIH guidelines when you're working on your proposal. So the thing that you want to know is if you're responding to a specific solicitation, that you're looking at what is different. NIH is one of the few organizations that's really very good about specifying most of the time in their solicitations, this is what is different in addition to or don't provide from the general guidelines. But if they ever don't say, you need to know that you always fall back on the general guidelines for what needs to be included. The agency contacts are listed in the opportunity. We mentioned that before. Sometimes they list more than one. So there could be a program officer contact that's listed that would be for your normal questions related to parts of the application that you're going to be submitted. They may also list the scientific review officer who would be able to answer questions related to the review panel, or possibly if you're not sure if this is the one you should submit to or not, you can send those questions to the scientific review officer and they will give you a yes or no or give you a recommendation for a different type of solicitation or panel that you might be submitting to. Sometimes they'll also provide a contact for grants.gov, which would be the person that we would reach out to if there was some type of problem with the submission systems. I also wanted to mention that if you haven't looked at the general guidelines before, they're kind of complicated, and we'll talk about them a little bit more in a minute. But they have what they call the annotated guide, which is like a highlighted area that explains some of the confusing parts that are in the solicitation. And they also have like reduced guides. So if you know that you're going to submit a research type of proposal, they took that whole big general guidelines and they made a copy just for research types of proposals. If you know you're going to be submitting for a fellowship or a training type of proposal, they made versions just for fellowship and just for training, so that it doesn't have all of the information for all of them all together, which kind of makes it more confusing to use. So I usually try and touch on this on most of our training that we do that talks about how guidance plays, I guess you would say. So at the top is always the federal requirements. We have to conform to the cost principles and the federal requirements that are in the Code of Federal Regulations. Most of the grants and contracts sponsored activities work falls under CFR Title II. It's a huge guide. And that is a lot of the things that your proposal development person in ORS will try and help you watch for. Like maybe you can't spend something in this certain area, but we can recommend a different area or way that you could word that makes it meet the requirements. So you have your federal requirements up above, and then the agencies have their general guidance, and sometimes they'll have specific guidance. NIH is one of the agencies that has both. So they have their general instructions that are always used on all submissions unless they tell you otherwise. And then they have their specific or instructions that come out in the program announcements and the RFAs that come out. And then once in a while, they'll have specific or special instructions that'll come out in their notices. Your submission may be impacted by state requirements. For example, especially if you have a subcontract with a state agency, so they'll have to comply with the state requirements. You may also be impacted by local policy. For example, our rate agreement might impact your proposal, and that has nothing related to any guidance that's coming out from NIH. It would be based on our negotiation for the rate agreement. So when you look at the how to apply the application guide, the current guidelines that we used are called the SF424 R&R. The version that we're using now is the F series. So whenever they change between alpha series, there'll usually be a period of time that you can apply to either the old series or the new series. And so you have to watch the guidelines closely to see if it specifies which one you're supposed to use. We went into the F series last October, so there's very few, if any, that are still going under the G series. The issue date is always on the front of the guidelines. And the big thing to understand about the general guidelines that NIH uses that is different than most of the other federal agencies is that it's not a static document. So if you go in and pull a copy, let's say you pulled one in January, and you're doing a submission in October, then you're liable to miss quite a few things that have updated or changed. So if you go in and pull copies down, you want to go back periodically, especially before you are doing your final files for submission, to make sure you've got a current copy. So what happens with NIH's general guidelines is they will either make changes to the actual guidelines that are posted, and so you have to look at the changes page to see what has updated, or they'll post notices that have impact on the general guidelines. And if you've ever looked at your parent guidelines, the R01, R21 parents, you'll see on the opening page of those, there's usually a list of notices that might impact what you have to provide for the submission that you're doing. So you want to make sure you always look through those notices and see if there's anything that looks like you need to open up and read that might impact the submission that you're working on. They normally post the new general guidelines in the fall, and they give anyone who wants to look at them a chance to go through and look at what is changing to see if they have any issues with it. The way that we submit to NSF are pretty much three ways normally. NIH Assist is the special program that NIH came up with to do submissions. We normally don't use it at OU, and I'll go into that more later, but there are some special proposals that we do through Assist, such as the COBRA funding. And these are multi-project proposals where we may have several different organizations participating in, and within that organization, there may be 3 or 4 more fully separate components. So they get really difficult to handle because they usually have anywhere from 10 to 20 different budgets and things all tied together. So normally we do those using the Assist. If you're going to be doing a submission using Assist at OU, you have to have special permission to do so, and it has to be done way in advance of the proposal deadline. Grants.gov is rarely used by OU or OUPIs because we have a system-to-system special software, which I talk about next, and that's what we use. If a PI wants to use grants.gov, then that has to have prior approval, and we need to have that in advance. If you're doing a fellowship that's going to be paid directly to you, then you would have to register with grants.gov, and you would do that submission yourself in grants.gov because it's not going to flow to the university, it's going to go to you. There are a few fellowships that they give you the option of either accepting the funds directly or having it run through the institution. And you have the option of either doing that initial submission on your own and then deciding later you want it to flow through the university, and we'll do the routing and everything on that just prior to award. If you know up front, it's usually better to go ahead and do the submission the way you intend the funds to be paid, so that there's not a holdup at the award where you have to go back to NIH and explain that you want the funds to flow through OU instead of accepting them personally. In the system to system, this is the way that we normally do our proposals at OU. It has an extra layer of error checks that it does on it, and so that's one of the reasons why we use it. It gives us a chance to look for problems before the submission actually goes into grants.gov or is sent on to NIH. It also gives us a way to quickly print out the proposal so that we can send it to you to review prior to submission if we have time, and it gives us a copy where we can pull it down and we can attach it to your file that's in Cayuse for use later. It takes the information and pushes it into grants.gov, and so at that point of submission, we do get a grants.gov tracking number, and then it goes through all the normal processes that any submission that goes into grants.gov does. If you have special instructions, once in a blue moon, they'll have a solicitation that comes out that asks for the submissions to go into an email address. So we follow whatever the special instructions say to do. But most of the time, you're going to be using the system to system, which means your person that's working with you in ORS will pull the package down for you, and you will just send some files to them. Your person in ORS will fill all the forms out, and we will be able to generate a print copy of you of everything to look at prior to the submission. So let's say you've been looking and you found something that you want to submit to and you haven't done a submission before. So one of the first things that you need to do is establish an ERA Commons account. There's a link on the VPRP website under Research Services, Proposal Submission Information, where you can obtain the ERA Commons account. You may need to obtain an ORCID registration. That depends on the solicitation, and I'll talk a little bit more about that before we conclude. Very rarely do you have to obtain a grants.gov registration, although the instructions in the solicitation may tell you to. Most of the time, your submissions are going to be done under the organizational registration that OU has. So unless you're accepting or putting in for a fellowship, you can usually always ignore the information in the solicitation that talks about grants.gov registration. And I would recommend, if you're not sure, don't do that registration until you talk with ORS, because we don't want you to create another registration for the University of Oklahoma. Submit your info sheet to ORS as early as you can, because this helps us prioritize workload. So for example, if we've had 15 other people submit info sheets for something due on the 5th of June, and it's all under one proposal development specialist, then we'll start trying to share the wealth a little bit, because there's no way one person's going to be able to do 15 submissions on the same day. This usually, when you do the info sheet, provides information where you might be contacted, for example, by the Office of Technology and Commercialization, or other compliance types of office, just to get you some information so that they can make sure that if you need to coordinate through their office later, that you know that. On the info sheet, because you will be dealing with a public health service type of organization, you will declare that you do have PHS FCOI involved in this proposal. And so someone will contact you to ensure that your declaration is done for processing, and it'll be flagged later on to make sure that you have the training if an award comes in prior to the award being set up. I'll note, if you're doing submissions outside of NIH, but to other public health service organizations, you may have to flag this. Examples of some others would be proposals going to CDC, proposals going to American Heart Foundation. So if you're not sure, flag it and we can double check it, or you can go to NIH's website. They have some links there that detail other public health service organizations that follow the PHSF FCOI policies. This is kind of a general timeline that looks at about a year out, where you, if you're new to doing proposals and you're not sure how much time you should allow, this would be an ideal situation kind of thing, where you're looking at putting together your research team and doing your literature review and starting to look for your funding announcement at about 8 to 12 months. And then at the 4 to 8 month range, you'll be submitting your info sheet, possibly sending an abstract to the program officer to make sure you're looking at the right type of solicitation, putting together a team that is going to look at your submission package to see how well it looks, or to help spot errors for you. At 2 to 4 months, you would be doing your routing for internal approval with ORS, and working on writing the main files of your proposal and getting some review comments back from the people that are going to be checking your package over. At 2 to 4 weeks, we would hope that you're starting to submit the application components, and within 1 week, we would hope that you would complete submission. If you don't do the submission at least 2 days before NIH's deadline, then you lose the opportunity to take advantage of what NIH calls a validation window. The validation window means that they're going to post your application in ERA Commons, and you have the opportunity to look at it, make sure that it crossed all the servers without any files corrupting, or any images or anything becoming blurred or not looking the way you'd like them to look. And you would be able to make corrections without running afoul of having to correct after the submission time, which would make you have a late submission. If you don't submit your proposal until the day of the deadline, you will still get notices about a 2-day validation window. But they are very clear in other areas of guidance, and we know from prior experience that that validation window may say that you've got 2 days, but if it's not something that's corrected by the time the deadline closes, then you really don't have that 2-day validation, because if you correct after the deadline closes, it would be considered a late submission, which most of the time is not accepted for review. And this kind of just goes through everything that I talked about before. We just kind of wrote it out. So if you miss something, or you have a question about when something happens, this gives you something where you can go back and check it in the process. So some of the things in the takeaway is be aware of the effect that presidential changes can have at NIH. So if you know that an election's coming up and the president's going to be changing, then you might want to look at who the new director is if they replace the director, and what the areas of interest that director has had in their CV, because that may impact some of the decisions on how funding is going to flow in the future within that division. The program officers at NIH don't get replaced as often as they do in some federal agencies. So they have many program officers that are there for extended years, not all of them, but they don't routinely cycle out. So for example, a lot of the program officers at the National Science Foundation cycle every 2 to 3 years. They will cycle periodically at NIH, but it's usually because the people have decided that they want to change where they're working, like they want to go to a different organization. Decide what institution or center your research fits into, and how what you're doing might tie into the mission of that particular division or center. Try to establish a relationship with your program officer. Possibly send them like a 1-page paper related to your work, and ask if you can set up a time to talk with them for a few minutes to make sure that you're in the right area, and ask if they've got any recommendations for particular solicitations that you might apply to. It's also recommended that you volunteer to review. You don't have to have a big background of experience. They look for a lot of different ranges of people and experience levels to review. In fact, they'll even look for people that don't have scientific backgrounds to sit on some of the review panels. Try not to start your process, especially with ORS, real close to the deadline, because it makes it harder for us to be able to help you as much as we would like. Be sure that you read the general guidelines so that you have a good understanding of what some of the file contents need to be. There's a lot of information available, including examples of files at NIH's website. There have been several recent notices that have come out since January this year, most notably related to BioSketch format and other support format. There is a new format available. You'll know that you're using the right one. It's in the upper right-hand corner. It talks about expiring in 2023. However, the new requirements, especially for the other support, include signing a certification statement and including copies of documents that illustrate or the actual agreements, like the contracts and agreements, if you're doing any work related to foreign involvement or for foreign organizations. You do have to still provide that information, although you're not required to use the most current forms until January. This was a change that came out in, they had one notice that came out that was going to make this effective in May, followed a month later by another one that delayed it being active until January. However, OU has decided to make these changes to the BioSketch and other support already effective, so they went effective the 1st of July here. If you have not attended the special briefings that we've done related to the BioSketch and other support, we have more of those scheduled. You can contact Cindy Clark to get that information, and we do have recordings of those posted on the website. NIH has been announcing for the last 1.5 to 2 years that they are going to require primary investigators to have ORCID registrations, and they are including that in the solicitations. They have also announced that at some point they're going to require every PI to have ORCID registrations, and it'll be referenced on all proposals. So if you don't already have one, you should be thinking about getting one. They've also announced that Science CV is going to become the way that they want to do business related to BioSketches and possibly other support. And they have announced, effective the last notice that came out in May related to BioSketches and other supports, that this will become effective sometime in fiscal year 2022. So we're already in fiscal year 22, so I'm expecting that this will start becoming a compliance item probably towards the end of the fiscal year. One of the notices that they sent out, I believe it was one of the ones in May, also mentioned that ERA Commons registration is going to be required for everyone who is listed as a senior key personnel in your proposal submission. This will also become effective in January. I recommend that learn about NIH. If you haven't done proposals with them before, check out the website. There's a lot of information that's there and a lot of like educational recordings and things like that. Sign up for listservs, both the general NIH one and for the specific centers that you're looking for, and look into some of the free conferences and podcasts that they have available. If you've got questions or you need help, you can contact this general RIS email address, and if the people there can't answer it, they'll forward it to other people within ORS to get you to the right person to answer your question. You're always welcome to submit the info sheet, and that will assign a proposal development specialist who will work with you, and they can help answer questions for you. We work really closely with the Center for Faculty Excellence, and they also are doing special training on Science CV training and also ORCID registration training. So if you don't have your account set up with those two different programs, you can go to CFE for assistance. If you have a question related to post-award, like submitting your RPPRs or anything related to your expenditure questions, then the contact for that is refsinfo@ou.edu.